I have to let you know that I was born and raised in the field of deaf studies. And I was always working to try to understand myself as a deaf person and try to understand deaf people better, who we are in the world and in the universe. Why are we the way we are? So I grew up with that analysis in mind always. My PhD is in linguistics. I studied both spoken and signed languages. Of course, I'm more fascinated and more interested in sign language, but my dissertation deals with English structures in print media, to be more specific. The title of my talk this morning is pulled from my dissertation on the analysis I did on newspaper articles. I will expand upon that and the process that I employed more later in my talk. I'm thrilled to be here to be able to talk to you about my dissertation work. I don't often have an opportunity to do so. Someone asked me how often that I've been able to present on this, and I said, maybe 5. So I'm thrilled to be invited here today to talk about my dissertation work. I think it's very interesting work, and it helps us better understand society's perspective of deaf people. Now, when I use the phrase deaf people, it doesn't mean that I'm excluding hard of hearing people. When I use the term deaf, it's an inclusive term. I mean everyone who may have a hearing loss. People who identify as deaf have various levels of hearing loss. It includes the hard of hearing population as well. I'm not being exclusionary by using the term deafness. I'm including all persons who have hearing loss in that term. When I started my research and my work on my dissertation, it was in the field of linguistics, of course, language and the structure thereof. But I wanted to study the cognition that was involved in the language process. That fascinated me. I tried to think of a way to incorporate cognition within the study of linguistics. I wanted to improve the understanding of people. I didn't want more separation to occur because of my dissertation. I wanted to see how we could incorporate and get people talking about deaf people in general and their position in society. So that led me to my question. The concept. I wanted to explore the image of deaf people. How do your regular average Americans have constructed images of deaf people? How do those come about? Why do they exist? Now, I decided to focus on newspaper articles that dealt with cochlear implantation. It's important to recognize CIs are not the topic of discussion today. It's not the point, but it's the discussion that the newspaper has about deaf people who get implantation. That is the focus of the talk today. If you went ahead and did a search on LexisNexis, it's a search engine for various journals and publications. It searches the entire world of publications. If you inputted deaf into LexisNexis, the articles that you would get don't really talk about deaf people themselves and their experience in the world necessarily. So I had to figure out how to narrow that focus. And I used cochlear implants as a means to narrow the search. So we're going to be talking about deaf people, not about the issue of CIs here. So my focus is not, again, CIs. My focus is how does our society view deaf people? What images are constructed? And how do we know? We have to look at linguistic structures, how those reflect the images that we have of deaf people in society in America today. That's basically what I'm going to talk about today. Okay? Everyone with me? One more thing. I picked articles published between 2006 and 2009. You might wonder why I did that. If you didn't limit the time, it would be an impossible mass of articles that I would have to sift through. I finished my dissertation. It was published in 2011. So I already had been analyzing the data for about 5 to 6 years before that. So I picked a 3-year span of articles that were published between 06 and 09. The technology within that 3-year span was pretty consistent as far as CIs were concerned. Many cochlear implant companies had to be approved via the FDA. To be eligible for implantation, you had to have what is called sensory neural hearing loss. And it has to be measured either between severe and profound. There are many requirements that an individual has to meet before they are approved for an implantation. Now, as time goes on, technology changes, and those requirements would change. So that's why I picked a defined amount of time, okay, just to control for those changes. I'm sure you know that when you do research or you embark on a study of something, you have to employ a framework or a theory that informs the way that will guide your research. So I had to find a framework that would suit the research that I wanted to do. I decided upon critical discourse analysis. Now, CDA as a field really came to the fore in the 1970s. At the same time, for example, perhaps you're familiar with the book The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, from the man Fleischer from Brazil. If you haven't read that book, oh, you really should read it. It is an important work. So Fleischer challenged people with the labels that we put upon people about what is normal, what is average, what is everyday person. We need to challenge how we improve or how we label each other so that as a society we can improve ourselves. So that started coming to the fore in about the 1970s. And the field of critical discourse analysis became popular at about the same time. So I employed CDA to inform my research. The purpose of CDA is to critically analyze communication within this society. How does society influence our discussions, and how does those discussions influence our society? Because language is in and of itself social. You cannot remove language from the societal context. It's impossible. So language itself is social. So we, as language users, whether you use ASL or English, whatever language you use, LSF, English, Spanish, what have you, that is all embedded in a social context. To understand the language and the communication that's happening, you have to understand the societal context in which it's situated. CDA recognizes that. It also recognizes, because language is social, often we use specific language structures to reflect our social cognition. And that can impact reality, the reality of the people that we're talking about. Impact how those people see themselves, how society sees them, and then that can impact how we think about them in turn. And this happens through the discourse structures. So CDA helps us to study the interrelationship between language ideologies and power structures. Language itself the written language, I focused on published newspaper articles. It talks about ideologies. Ideologies includes our knowledge, our attitudes, and our perceptions, our views of everything. It also links with social structures, people's roles, their positions in society. So all of those things, how they are related, is dealt with in the framework of CDA. So if those three are related, that means that language is often a place in which we can analyze how people are perceived through linguistic structures. That's basically my dissertation in a nutshell, if you will. I used a lot of Van Dyke's framework and his work on social cognition. It's important that we recognize how our attitudes about myself and my group of people and about other people, it directly affects social structure. My attitude isn't visible. So how can my attitude be seen within a social structure? It can be seen through the interface of discussion and discourse. How we use language. Analyzing the language can help us understand the way we use language to apply our mental models. Social cognition deals with our ideas, our beliefs, our attitudes, and the like. And that helps construct all of the mental models that we carry with us, that we apply to various different situations. We have memories within us. We have context that we already know in the abstract. So, for example, when you got into this room, how did you know what to do? How did you know to take a seat and sit in the back or sit in the front? You already knew, you already had a mental model of how to behave when you attend a presentation. Your language use will be affected by all of your mental models. The way I'm using language right now, how I'm explaining my ideas, would be different than if we were sitting in a pub together. We'd have a completely different conversation in a different context. So my mental model of how to behave while presenting is much different than the mental model I employ when I'm in a bar. Mental models also feed into social cognition. That affects your language use. And language use affects social cognition and your mental model. So it's a two-way street, if you will. Van Dyke in his work applied most often to racism and the study of racism. How do people view race as evidenced by their language use? I'm applying it to the view of deaf people. Remember, I'm using the word deaf as an umbrella term to include all various deaf peoples. Deaf blind, hard of hearing, deaf black, deaf straight, gay. Everyone who has a hearing loss is included in the term deaf. I'm focusing on deaf and hard of hearing people. What is the constructed image of deaf people? I wanted to find out. That is my big question. What is the constructed image of deaf people as seen through newspaper articles published about cochlear implantation? Okay, now I'm going to explain my data set. I have the theoretical framework, CDA, Critical Discourse Analysis. Now I'm going to talk more in depth about the data that I collected. I decided to use nationally published newspaper articles. How did I go about choosing them, you might be wondering. I looked at readership. I picked the newspapers with the highest readership in the United States. The top one was the Wall Street Journal. The highest readership in the United States is owned by the Wall Street Journal. But they don't discuss people in general. They more discuss economic issues and business. So that one came off the list. The newspapers with the highest readership are the ones here: New York Times, USA Today, The Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times. The USA Today has the highest readership in the United States, about 2 million people, at least at the time between 06 and 09. The New York Times has about 1 million people. The Washington Post's readership averages about 500 to 600,000 people. I did not include, but I do recognize that those large newspapers own much smaller, more local newspapers. They also own radio and television shows. So those ideas are disseminated throughout the nation. These 4 giant companies represent the majority. If I remember correctly, I want to say the New York Times also owns newspapers in Iowa, as well as the western part of the United States. So that means that their message is disseminated through those other newspapers. It tends to be the practice that newspaper companies disseminate information if they want to disseminate a consistent message. So that means if the New York Times publishes a specific article, one of their subsidiary companies will publish an article with the same message. It wouldn't be a disparate message because that wouldn't provide consistency. That's valuable knowledge to have in this instance of analysis. So these ideas are being disseminated throughout the United States based on the fact that these 4 large companies all of these newspapers are award-winning media outlets. They have recognized authors and very renowned published articles. I used a search engine. I used 3 different search engines: LexisNexis, Academic Search Premier. There was another one, and ProQuest. So those 3 search engines were employed. And I was looking for keywords: cochlear implant or cochlear implantation. Those were my search phrases. After that search, I came up with about 226 articles that hit the 06-09 years. From those 226 articles, I realized that some of the articles discussed lawsuits because something happened with the device, something went wrong, and wasn't talking about people. They were therefore taken out of the body of my research. I wanted articles that focused on discussions of deaf persons. So if it was about a lawsuit, they were excluded. I narrowed down the field to about 86. I believe it was 86 articles in total. Then I looked at those 86 articles, made sure they were talking about deaf people. Some of them discussed deaf children, some deaf adults. They were all related to cochlear implants, but some of them were talking about younger versus older populations. It's important to know that the reason why I focused on CIs. In 2006 to 2009, the FDA approved 4 implant companies: MedTel, Cochlear America. There were a few others. And there were very strict requirements for implantation of people. The FDA required that people who were eligible for implantation must have sensory neural hearing loss. So being able to fix their hearing in a different way would be impossible. So they had to have the sensory neural hearing loss and severe to profound level of hearing loss. So in these articles, the topic were actually deaf people. That was critical for my research.
So when I searched my media selections with the lens of the critical discourse analysis, I began to consider the ideological perspective reflected in those articles of a variety of groups of people. And I saw the potential of the ideological use of a framework to define people through those articles. So that's where I began. Naturally, there's a bias in any print media. There's a bias that all of us present. It's impossible to present research without a bias. So I know I brought mine with me. It's impossible to consider any two individual stories without considering the possible bias. So I knew I had my own bias when I began this work. And simply, my bias was my own life experiences as a deaf person growing up in the deaf community and the larger hearing world. So because of that, I recognized the bias, and I began to analyze the articles for their linguistic presentation of the stories. When you consider what can you analyze when you're looking at discourse, you have to remember that discourse as a linguistic structure is a large umbrella of possible choices. So I needed to determine where my focus would lie. There were a number of things I could choose from, but I decided on these three analytic structures. The reason I chose these three is so that I could consistently show a constructed image amongst the articles I would represent, although I wasn't sure that that would be the case. I may have ended up with some information that would be invalid if I chose any other discourse structures to analyze. So these three are linked. It was possible that they would all show consistent information, but I needed a way to ensure that my analysis of the articles would be consistent and that it would show the constructed image as reflected in the language use of the article. The first one is lexical choices. Those are simply the words that are used. Implications is next, and implications is what is the message beyond the words. And then local and global coherence are a reflection of how we understand what it is we read and the relationship between the sentences as they're presented in the article. Many times one sentence itself doesn't tell the entire message, but a number of sentences together in an article will give us a constructed message. Local coherence is intrasentential coherence, the words coming together to form one single message, and global coherence is the larger meta-message of the article as a whole. So here I'll talk about lexical choices. as I read the variety of literature options in my data set, there was one person who came upon doing some work of Israeli and Palestinian lexical choices. What was used to represent individuals who were Israeli as opposed to individuals who were Palestinian. Again, it was a variety of work that was presented to me, but what this person discovered is that the nouns, the verbs, and the adjectives presented in the print media, as well as the adverbs, from those parts of speech and language, they were able to construct evaluative images of a particular group of people. There are many, many words that comprise an article, but I was only focusing on those 4 parts of speech. Remember, I had 86 articles to begin with, and I had to analyze every word. Every word was coded and removed and categorized. So I categorized all of the nouns. And there were nouns that were used to talk about or represent deaf people in those articles, as well as hearing people. I was able to, through my analysis, come up with 2 distinct categories. The verbs, the adjectives, and the adverbs all settled out the same way. It was through my research that I found that some adjectives really needed to be connected with a particular noun. Some adverbs needed to be connected with a particular verb. So, for example, if you talk about communication, 2 words that typically came up together were communication, a little bit of communication, communicate a bit, to communicate a bit. The a bit adverb talks about the level of communication, and so those 2 were linked together. I couldn't separate them, so I'll give you some examples in later slides. But some lexical choices needed to be linked together. So not every single word was able to be counted. In some cases, words were strung together and had to remain that way. So if you say the phrase, "It's raining cats and dogs," you're not able to separate those words and have the phrase have the same meaning. Some nouns were able to stand alone, others were bound phrases. Some characteristically talked about deaf people, others characteristically spoke about hearing people. It's important to understand this because if you talk about and describe deaf and hearing people using the same terms, then the constructed image will be the same for those 2 groups. So it was important for me to separate them and see how they were different so that I could then begin to analyze how the constructed image of deaf people begins to arise. So, 86 articles, all the nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. I believe I ended up with about 1,300. I don't remember the number exactly, but around 13,000 word lists. There were repetitions. I began to parse out the words with, in parentheses, the number of times they appeared within each article. And then I began to separate them into word lists that described deaf people and those that described hearing people. From that, they naturally formed a number of larger categories. There were categories that spoke about isolation, separation, loneliness, lack of integration. Those were all grouped together to their own category. There were some words that began to form the category of unable to do something, the inability to go to school or have gainful employment. These words naturally formed their own pattern of categorization as I began to put them together. So within each subcategory, a larger category began to form as well. And so I began to form my larger labels of the lexical choices based on the content. So for the very first category up at the top, on the left you see deaf, on the right you see hearing, and so any of the words in each of those categories talks about that group of people. You'll see at the bottom a total word count, 799 for deaf, 562 for hearing, and that's a total word count of nouns, verbs, adverbs, and adjectives. Now, as the words appear, they began to be grouped together based on what characteristic it was of that group of people that was describing. So on the left in the category of deafness, you'll see a number of words. The first one at the top being isolated or isolating. You'll see below that the phrase isolation and isolating appeared 8 times in the articles that were assessed. Next to that is silence or silent. Now I think it's important that we have an understanding of the semantic intent of the word. The words all together really give you a sense of separation, a lack of integration, and it's important to recognize how they're used. That appeared, silent and silence appeared 7 times. Then there's the word struggle. Struggle to integrate, struggle to accept. That appeared 6 times. Marginalized, invisible margins, living within the margins. Phrases like that appeared a total of 4 times. Separate appeared 2 times. Misunderstand, misunderstood, misunderstood by people, misunderstanding within communications appeared twice. Dropout, dropping out from everyday life activities. There was one phrase that said began to drop out from church and school activities. That phrase again shows a separation and an isolation. Distance appeared 1 time. Withdrawal, meaning again not being included. Out of it appeared 1 time. Ignore, shunned, and communicate a bit, the phrase I mentioned earlier, meaning unable to communicate freely, thus being isolated from the larger group. That gives you an initial target image of communication and isolation for a deaf person as represented in the article. You then see in the column on the right for hearing people the words like mainstream, communicate, talk, conversation, converse, respond, interact, relationships and relations, theater, theater going, make hearing friends, involved, and participate. Completely opposite constructed image, semantically presented by those words. Now the articles were speaking about cochlear implantation. What was common in each of the articles was that not one pattern was ever broken. All of the 86 articles upon assessment for children and adults who were implanted carried with it this very pattern of language use. Children and adults post-implantation, typically words were used what you see on the right, able to work with, able to communicate with. And so hearing people and the ability to hear is characterized very differently. If you're talking about a child, it's that they won't be deaf anymore. It's believed that they'll be hearing. That's the societal view as a constructed image of a post-implantation deaf person. So if you look at these 2 categories and you consider the individuals that it characterizes as someone being able to integrate into a community or being isolated from a community, it begins to give you a very constructed view of how hearing people are involved in the world and deaf people are incapable of being integrated into their society or into their communities. So those 2 categories together, I labeled a larger category of integration. For deaf people, the category of integration is called isolated, and for hearing people, it's called integrated. So that's just an example of, through the lexical choice analysis, I was able to form a number of naturally forming categories and patterns. The next one down is dependency, broken down into dependent for deaf people and independent for hearing people, or the ability to hear. Emotive is the next one down. Negative terms like suffer, struggle, are very different in constructing a view of deaf people than they are for the positive category, with smiles and hope and secure and energetic being positive characteristics. Below that, you'll see abilities, deaf people being characterized as unable, hearing people being characterized as able. Simply because of their ability to hear, they are thus able to do a number of activities. You'll actually see that in one of the newspaper articles, a young child's inability to walk is blamed on their inability to hear. Their lack of milestone development is blamed on their hearing loss. Normality is below that. Deaf people characterized as defective, broken, damaged. Hearing people characterized as normal. They don't need to be fixed. They're not broken in any way. And then finally, community cohesion. This is a very interesting category. If you notice on the left for deaf people as they're identified, the terms ASL based, separate or separatism, so the practice of separatism, resisting or resistance, able to resist, absolutists, militants, very small, dismissive was a term that arose once. Cliquish, clinging, those are used to describe deaf people and the hearing view of the community connectedness of deaf individuals. The terms used to describe people who had the ability to hear post-implantation was expert, specialist, thankful. Worry appeared 5 times, concern, again thankful, supportive, unbiased, wonderful. So you already begin to have a vision of how lexical choices can begin to divine how the larger society has a constructed image of people who are deaf and people who have the ability to hear. So now I'll give you an example from one of the articles. This is pulled from one of the newspaper articles directly. So this is an example of the word isolation and how it's used to describe deaf people. What essentially is the message? How is isolation being used? Isolation is occurring because the individual is deaf, not because the person doesn't know how to communicate or get along with others. Isolation is occurring simply because of the person's inability to hear. There's another word that was used in the article, mainstreamed, that gave a very different constructed image of individuals who can hear based on their implantation. So in this case, mainstream is connected with what type of feeling? Activities like going out to restaurants, being able to attend movie theaters, having an attraction a reason to come to Gallaudet. Later on in the slides, I'll talk about the implication of these lexical choices, but for now, I'm just focusing on the simple lexical choice of mainstream versus isolation. Mainstreaming characterizing people who can hear, isolation characterizing people who are deaf. Now, the implications of these lexical choices are that deaf people don't necessarily enjoy going out to restaurants or seeing movies. That's really the beginning of the constructed image that this one sentence begins to build. That they're isolated, that they don't ever leave their homes. It implies that they don't get out and enjoy these normal activities. Now, I began with the lexical analysis of nouns, verbs, adverbs, and adjectives. And again, they parse themselves out beautifully into a number of categories. The pattern naturally arose from the lexical choices, and from there, I began to wonder if the same pattern would emerge if I began to give analysis to the implications of those lexical choices. So implications are essentially if someone expresses meaning A, but also means B, that's an implication. There's a meaning beyond the initial semantic presentation of the word. For example, this senator this government worker accepted money from another individual. That particular phrase, on its face, has one meaning, but it implies that the government worker accepted a bribe, and thus they are corrupt. The implied meaning is of corruption. On its face, the sentence does not say the word corrupt. It doesn't explicitly say that, but its implication is that if you understand there are rules that dictate what government workers can accept, then we understand if someone accepted a cash gift from another, then they are corrupt. So in this case, we say meaning A, but there's an implication of a second meaning B, and we understand that based on our understanding of the world at large. So I wondered if those same patterns and implications would begin to arise when I looked deeper at the lexical choices.
I'm going to give you a few different examples. This isn't the research in its entirety. This is just a few examples. I have pages and pages of implications that I wasn't able to fit on this slide. Let me tell you, there are many, many of them. The categories are based on what categorizes deaf individuals and what categorizes individuals that can hear. So for example, you'll probably notice that in my research I noticed that the same patterns, the same polarizing patterns appear. And this idea of quality of life was something new that came up when I was analyzing implications. It wasn't there with the lexical choices. Just for an example, related to the quality of life, this says Ms. Brown, 29, right, whose real name is Inga Marchand. And if you know music, you probably know who Inga Marchand is. Ms. Brown is a rapper. She's a rap artist. Foxy Brown. So, she complained in jail that she was having hearing problems and they were getting worse because her cochlear implant needed to be repaired and reprogrammed. So she could face serious harm because of her inability to hear while she was in prison. So what is implied in that sentence? That her quality of life and her health and safety was at risk. If you can't hear, you have a low quality of life, you're not safe. Your ability to be safe is lessened. If you can hear, you have a higher quality of life. It says, as an audiologist working with cochlear implant recipients, I witnessed daily the quality of life improvements achieved through this marvelous device. So this means that with a CI, the person can hear, and therefore their quality of life will be improved. So that implies that if you can hear, you will have a higher quality of life compared to someone who is unable to hear. This is another new category that emerged that wasn't there within the lexical analysis. And it is a connected theme throughout the 86 articles that I analyzed. Now the ideas of independent versus dependent is there as well. I'm just going to give you 2 examples from my study. What is implied behind this paragraph of information? That deaf people cannot be good parents. How do you protect your children if you can't hear? That's what is implied in these few sentences. What else is implied? Any other ideas? Yes. Good point. It's implied that deaf people are not safe. They are a danger to society. They're a danger to themselves. Right? That's exactly right. So it didn't say that explicitly in those 3 sentences, but the implied meaning is understood. How we understand the role of parent and the role of a child, that is abstracted according to our mental models. If our mother or father can't be there to support the child and protect the child, something's wrong. Something is not right, that's dangerous. So that is another instance of implication. You know, A, parents are supposed to protect their children. B, if you're deaf, you cannot protect your children. With this example, it talks about early implantation is encouraged. Reason being that children who can access hearing earlier will acquire language. That's the A. What's the implied meaning here? What's the message behind the explicit message? That language is spoken. They do not recognize American Sign Language as a valid language. They focus on the spoken language. What other implications are here? Yes? It implies that children are not learning sign. If you look at this, it says the implant helps children integrate the sound with the speaker's lip movements. And then they develop an expertise in using language. So being able to hear improves their ability to use spoken language and to integrate into society. If you look at the lexical choices, it's very interesting. The word communicate often comes up. Dealing with deaf people, they say communicate a little bit. Communicating using signs. For ability to hear, communication is often changed to language. So that is a reflection of our mental model and our social cognition in regard to deaf people and how they use language or how they communicate, and hearing people and their use of language as opposed to how they communicate. So that is an example of the implication analysis that I did on these articles. Now I have a question. I began to question local and global coherence as the third part of my analysis of these 86 articles. Remember that I analyzed 86 articles. It was impossible to analyze all 86 articles in depth. So I thought it was important to pick one representative article. And I established some criteria to pick that article. The article had to discuss CI throughout its entirety. Some articles mentioned CIs and then went on to discuss other things. Another criteria was it had to discuss the life of an individual who is born or becomes deaf by age of 5 and receives a CI. Also, the article that I would choose had to contain lexical choices and implications characterizing both deaf and hearing individuals. So that helped me narrow the field down to 6 articles, from 86 to 6. All 6 had a representation, but from that 6 I picked one article entitled Giant Steps for Ear Implants. Now devices are more suitable for deaf children. Before I go ahead with this and discuss local and global coherence, I want to explain a little bit more in depth local coherence. Within a sentence, how do you know the information is related? I'm going to give you just an example to illustrate what I'm talking about. So in the English sentence, he rode his horse into the sunset. He jumped on his horse and rode into the sunset. That's the sentence. Now, can you ride into the sunset and then jump on your horse? You can't do that. Why can you not do that? You have to represent what's possible in the world. So how do we build those connections? We have mental models that help us understand the language that based on our own personal experience. Now let me give you a more pointed example. He was born deaf, so he didn't have language. Okay? So within that, when people read that sentence, they understand. They have a mental model that that sentence fits into. That is called local coherence by linguists. So, means a cause and effect relationship. He was born deaf, and that causes the fact that he didn't have any language. And that fits within our mental model of the world. It says a lot about our constructed images of deaf persons. We all have mental models within us. We all have that mental model. But we also can have alternative mental models and alternative understandings that help us challenge and combat sentences like those and mental models that those. We can recognize the errors that that sentence contains. But generally, I think more importantly, we all are able to understand that sentence because of global coherence. That local coherence is accomplished. That is within our mental model and knowledge of the world. Global coherence quite simply means it's beyond the sentential level. This sentence and this sentence continues the flow of the information. I'll provide an example. It's not I'm not going to show you the full article, but I'm just going to give you a couple sample sentences so you can see the process that I went through. I was warned that I just have 7 minutes. I'll lead you through the process, then we can go ahead and open for questions, okay? The first few letters of each word are cut off, but it reads, 6-year-old Serena Rush loves to belt out It's a Hard Knock Life, her favorite tune from the musical Annie, and someday she hopes to be a stage actress when she's not being a lifeguard, which is pretty splendid considering she was diagnosed as deaf when she was 1. I am very smart, says the ballet dancing, iPod jamming, theater going, soon to be 2nd grader from Silver Springs, Maryland. Serena is now able to hear much of her world with the help of a cochlear implant she received when she was 2.5. So let's start with the title. Giant Step for Ear Implants. Okay, giant steps. What does that phrase mean to you? It means a vast improvement, right? Very impressive. It means progression, a success, a huge success, yes. When has that word used before, right? When the man landed on the moon. When Neil Armstrong touched down on the moon, he said, a giant step for mankind. So really, that phrase is being borrowed to show progress and success. And they're linking it to ear implants. Then there's the use of a semicolon. The use of a semicolon means the idea is not finished. The next idea that we're going to express is related to the first idea. So your brain can make sense of that. Giant steps for ear implantation. Now devices are more suitable for deaf children. So we understand that this huge advancement in ear implants are now suitable for deaf children. They can be used more broadly. So now we know that these two ideas hang together, and that idea is carried forward through the communication. The title is often very important. People read the title and they have a clue as to which mental model or frame will be employed to read the entire article. Now you know that you're looking at the article through talking about a success using technology with deaf children. The article, this is just the first 3 paragraphs of the article. It talks about 6-year-old Serena Rush. She loves to sing It's a Hard Knock Life from her favorite musical Annie. Some of her favorite. In the future, she hopes to become a stage actress when she's not working as a lifeguard, which is pretty splendid considering that she was diagnosed as deaf when she was 1. Okay, let's back up just a bit. Remember the title. The fantastic advancement happened. So how is the progress represented within the article? She is singing. She wants to be a stage actress. She wants to work as a lifeguard. She has dreams and aspirations. And it explains what kind of things she can do. The lexical choices, theater going, integration, Carnegie Hall, all of those things deal with, wanting to go to restaurants, going to the theater, all relates to being hearing. All talks about involvement and integration of people who have hearing ability in society. So they're saying that this is amazing. She was diagnosed at 1, And how could she have access to all these hopes and aspiration? Because of the implant. So the local coherence carries throughout and becomes global coherence for the entire article, as all of the phrases and language used talks about this one young lady who is very smart and received a cochlear implant, therefore she can be more hearing-like and successful. They talk about her ballet dancing, jamming to her iPod, going to the theater. She's going to be a second grader very soon. So that thought of ability and integration is carried throughout the article. And it does continue throughout the entire article, I can tell you. So these are two examples of local and global coherence that is related to lexical choices and implicature. Here it is in a graph form. The analysis that I have done shows the different categories. This is the lexical choices of how deaf people are described. The lexical choices are categorized. Then you can move over to the implications and see the categories. But a new category, as I said before, shows up regarding low quality of life for people with hearing loss. And then local and global coherence as well deals with low quality of life for people who have hearing loss. There is overlap among the three. Local and global coherence doesn't mention the emotive category. But of course, I want to remind you, this is just analysis of one article. But you can see the overlap and the scaffolding that occurs. So the constructed image of deaf persons is here in front of you now. We have the constructed image of deaf people and the constructed image of people who can hear. Not hearing per se, but people who can hear. And it's a glaring, polarizing opposition. It's a construction of an us and them. Remember, language is not used in a vacuum. It's not disconnected from society. It is social. It cannot exist in its own without a group of people. So language can reflect ideological views of persons. Now this is an illustration of the polar oppositeness of constructed images of deaf people and hearing people as inferred from the analysis that I have done. I will summarize this and then we'll be done. One thing that I want you to leave with is that I have my own personal bias. I was born and raised in the deaf community, but I wanted to make sure that my bias did not influence my analysis of these articles. When I first wrote down all these lexical choices, the nouns, the verbs, adjectives, adverbs, hear, can hear, can't hear, I was a bit concerned. There wasn't one positive word employed to describe deaf persons. And I thought, that might be my view biasing my research. So I went ahead and looked at it again. Does this word describe a deaf person? Does that word describe a hearing person? I reviewed it again. Again, it was the same result. So I went through it a third time. 86 articles. I went through them 3 times. Analyzed them at the lexical level again. Then I employed my chair to help me. My chair checked. Then I had a colleague check my work. They came up with the same result. Not one positive word was used to describe deaf persons. Now, when they're talking about deaf persons who can hear, either because of an implant or because they're working with deaf people, positive words abounded. It just clearly shows our society's constructed image of deaf persons and their quality of life. The view of these people impacts their lives as well. In closing, I could explain many different aspects of my research. I didn't cover all the parts of it. I encourage you to read my dissertation and discuss it. Contact me if you would like more clarification, if you have questions. I think this is critical, that we need to understand how society views deaf people. Knowing that, we can improve the way we work with society. We as a community must become aware of how society represents us and how they view us. If we want a solution, we have to know how we're viewed, and then we can work towards a better existence.
Well, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. I'd like to open the floor for questions at this point. If you have a question, please do come up to the left side of the room. We have just a few minutes left for questions, should there be any. Does anyone have any questions? Again, please feel free to come to the front.
Hello, I really enjoyed your presentation. The question I have for you is, when you're discussing bias and you were categorizing all the lexicon, I have a question in that: is bias present in your choice of articles? Because I'm assuming that as you looked at the articles, you specifically were looking at those that discussed cochlear implants. Generally, when you do that, it's a medical or pathological view. So I'm wondering if maybe, obviously this is not new to us, that they view us as being broken, but I'm wondering if you had looked at different types of articles, would you have had different types of results?
Well, that might be a study that you'd like to undertake.
Okay, have you thought about that yourself?
I did think about that. If you recall, my dissertation had to have an end date. It had to have a final sentence with the very last period. So it means that I had to find an initial place to focus, and I had to choose a scope. He's absolutely right. I could have chosen an alternative conceptual framework and thus different articles to research. My personal feeling on it is, from the field of deaf studies and looking at media, new media, there may be an instance or two where you've got a positive representation, but it's not an aggregate, cumulative view that has been constructed that is positive. So I needed to look at the entire spectrum of all of what was presented to me and consider how it panned out. So there is a recognition that it's just, I didn't want to say I found one positive article or a few instances that spoke about it positively. I wanted a historical,
Thank you, I appreciate your
accurate
answer.
representation of the cumulative representation of deaf people. Any other questions while we have a few minutes?
So I'd like to say thank you so much for your presentation. It was really wonderful, and I learned so much. And at the same time, I know your dad. I can see your dad in you, the way you sign, the way you talk about things. It's really wonderful to see your dad within you here today. I was wondering, I'm not sure if this fits your analysis or not, but I'm sorry, I can't see. Could you turn, please? When you talk about media representation of deaf people, I also realize that they talk about solutions, cochlear implants, and they feel that that's a positive thing. But not everyone has a good experience with cochlear implants. Oftentimes there are complications that arrive. They can hear, but they're frustrated because of other things. So I've never seen any articles discussing the negative parts of implants, only the positive results. Have you seen anything like that?
That's interesting. I began with 286 articles, and I removed the ones that didn't speak about deaf people per se. Now, there were articles that spoke about the problems of implantation, but they typically ended up in litigation, suing the companies. It didn't speak about the people and the experience that the people had. So there were articles that spoke about that. Now, why they're framed in such a way, I don't know. It's certainly something to give pause and thought to, and another way to consider the implications of print media. Any other questions? Any other questions for Dr. Fleischer? Last chance. Anything? There we go. Here comes someone.
I have one.
Other way. There you go.
Today, when you were talking about your research and your dissertation, I noticed, how do you plan? Is there a way to buy it? Is there a way to change the media's perception of deaf people through everything you said? I wonder what we do now. When you think about the future and all the information you've brought to bear, what do we do with it at this point?
That's a good question. You have to remember, I alone can't change the world. It requires that we work as a community together. Within the community, there is a recognition, of course, that there is division politically within a community, but where we need to come together and unify is in combating and resisting the constructed image. So I alone can't make those changes. I do recognize that. I hope that this information is helpful, that it adds to the literature and the base of knowledge that we have, and adds to ways that we can talk about these things and begin to build resistance as a community together. Most people will never read my dissertation. Of those of you in the audience who read it, the interpreters read it. We know they did. Absolutely. Poor things. But they take their work seriously, and so for that I thank them. But really, I recognize that most people won't be reading my dissertation. Now, how this will translate and be disseminated, who knows? Life happens. Life is busy. I still have a number of things. I would like to translate this into some sort of book form. And in that case, there would probably be greater dissemination to the community. But it is a first step in working together and creating change. So thank you, everyone, with that. Thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Fleischer. I've enjoyed it immensely. It's an interesting framework to consider critical discourse analysis and how it's applied to the study of language, the lexical choices, the implications and such as they arise. Wonderful work. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for having me. And I'm so glad to have arrived. Even though it was 3 this morning, I'm very happy to be here. I'd like to thank our interpreters today for the wonderful work that they've done. They prepared diligently. Carolyn Kropp, Nicole Kraus-Dickerson, thank you for your work. As well as Cynthia Callward, thank you for your work as well.